Hello and welcome to another edition of Empathy at the Table. I'm here with Michael Gates, who is an experienced trainer and director in the professional training and coaching industry. He has worked in the field of cross-culture negotiations for over 30 years, teaching corporations and governments, as well as business schools and universities. He teaches at Oxford University and is an adjunct professor at the Zhejiang University in China. British, half Austrian, living in Helsinki. So you go figure this out. I'm really pleased to invite you onto the show, Michael. But before I do that, I always like to check a little bit about what other people say about my guests. And I've got two quotes which I love, which really made me want to meet with you. One said, he was a very he has very unique teaching techniques and is able to articulate his ideas and stories with aplomb. Second was he is an extremely energetic and captivating and knowledgeable personality, and he also has a great sense of humor.
Well, not much to live up to then.
No pressure, Michael. Welcome to Empathy at the Table.
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here.
So I guess to kick off on the runway, just to maybe introduce yourself to people who may not know you, just give a little bit about your background and your interest in how they began in this idea of cross-cultural communication.
I studied English literature at university, and you may think, well, what's the connection between what I do these days and what I studied? And on the surface, not very much, but studying literature is about communication, it's about style, it's about motivation and character. So in a way, it fits quite well. And then I worked after university for 5 years in radio in Manchester, in independent radio, and then decided to come over to, somewhere abroad for a year, just because I fancied trying living abroad. And I applied for a job in Spain, and when I went to the interview, they said, how about Finland? So I took a deep breath and said, okay, I'll try it. And that was in 1987, so a long time ago. Right. And at the time, I was teaching communication and presentation skills. But then that changed, within a couple of years to cross-culture, because I was working with a cross-culturalist gentleman called Richard Lewis, and he had moved from communication to more on the cross-cultural side. And I found this was very interesting.
Yeah, I mean, when you look at the world of cross-cultural communication, you know, it does sound, it's very broad. And so I kind of wanted to, before we launch into it, I wanted to hone in a little bit and ask you, who are the people that actually benefit from the knowledge you have in your head? When you think about your ideal person, the customer that might hire your services, company that might work with you, who are they and how do they benefit?
They come from many different fields, but the challenges that people have are very often the same, even if they're in a very different industry or profession. And it's people, first of all, it helps them, I think, become more international in their careers. But I've actually found that the people who generally respond the best are the ones who already have a lot of international experience, but they may have gone around the world causing trouble and not realizing it. And then they, on the training, say, well, I recognize these situations and gosh, I wish I'd known this 10 years ago, 20 years ago, because it's a framework that we're providing which enables people to then apply that in a very practical way and modify the way that they do things to get better results across cultures. Mm.
So let's kick off. I know you're a great storyteller, and as one story, I've already used it 4 or 5 times because I absolutely love it. And it's going back 37 years ago to your first negotiation with a Finnish guy. I'd really love you to share that story.
Pekka. Gosh, Pekka, yeah. Well, I mean, my background is, as I said, both British and Austrian, but the Austrian side was actually Slavic. And so my mother was extremely talkative. You know, it was very difficult to get a word in edgeways, and you had to be talkative in our family to survive. My father wasn't that talkative, but he did survive. And anyway, and I suppose now thinking about my interest in culture and my wish to go to Spain, it really fits in with my cultural type, which is quite talkative, fairly extrovert and fairly loud, and not at all with the place I ended up. And I was trying to sell communication skills, presentation skills training. So I go into this meeting with a gentleman, Becker, and he was an older Finn and really very, very silent. And the first thing that happened was I noticed that he wasn't making any eye contact at all. He was looking at his shoes while I was speaking to him. And there's an old joke that you can tell the difference between a Finnish introvert and an extrovert. Because if you're talking to an introvert, he looks at his shoes. And if it's an extrovert, he looks at your shoes. Anyway, things didn't seem to be going well. He made no small talk at all. He was just answering yes, no, and looking very grim. So after about 20 minutes, I was feeling a bit desperate. So I thought I'd better tell him the price. So I said, this package of training is going to cost you 100,000 Finmarks. And there was silence. And I was feeling the pressure because when people behave or communicate differently from the way in which we do naturally, then it causes emotional pressure. And so I gave him about 10 seconds, and then I said, well, I'm prepared to drop the price to 95,000. Terrible negotiator at that time. And still silent, so I dropped it to 90,000. Then I said, look, my last offer is 85,000. And eventually he said, okay. And I thought, thank goodness, I just want to get out of here. This is a really unpleasant experience. Anyway, things went well and we got more business. And then after about 6 months, one day he said to me, you like to come to sauna? And I thought, well, this is a good sign. I've read the books now and I know that if they invite you for a sauna, your client, then that's a pretty good sign. So we're sitting in the sauna. And Pekka, how do I put it in a British way? He was a little bit more relaxed. He'd had a few beers and some vodka and... Anyway, I thought I'd tackle him on this. I said, Pekka, you're a very powerful negotiator. What do you mean? And I said, and I reminded him, he said, I wasn't negotiating. So I said, well, what were you doing? He said, I was thinking. Okay, not a bad idea sometimes. And I said, well, what were you thinking? He said, I was thinking 100,000 is a very fair and reasonable proposal. So, well, thanks a lot, Pekka, you really put me through it. And can you be a little bit more explicit? What exactly were you thinking? And he said, I was thinking, I'd like to say, I'm very interested for this proposal. And then I thought again, interested for, interested of, interested about. And before I remembered that the preposition after interested is in, you said 95,000. So I thought, I wait a little longer. And when you said 85,000, well, I felt sorry for you. So, really, I wasn't taking into account the style of negotiation of some, not all, but of some Finns, and quite a few, you will come across this fairly often.
Yeah, I've had a Finnish guest on the show, and I asked him the question about the relationship that Finns have with silence. And he said, oh, yeah, it's absolutely true that he used to drive regularly 8 hours with one of his partners. He was in law enforcement, and he said, and we would sit in silence for 8 hours quite comfortably. And so it brings me to the point you made about how we get uncomfortable when people communicate with us in different ways, which are culturally nuanced, but we have a different perception. So we kind of read into that differently. And when we're negotiating, we need to be aware of that. So what are your views on how we can maybe become more proficient in understanding these differences in communication?
I think the first thing is to understand ourselves. And we may think that we're coming across really well. We may think that our way of communication subconsciously is how you do it, and it could be things like, well, obviously is a dangerous word, because it may be obvious to me, but not to you, that, for example, if you're giving feedback to someone in a negotiation, that you do it directly and you say exactly what you think. But for the other culture, it might be that they are more indirect And if you're direct with them, that this makes them feel bad, and they feel as maybe you've made them lose face. And then, so understanding the values as well, underlying communication, both for yourself and for the other party. And I mean, obviously, there's some things which are common across cultures. So, like survival. Everyone generally wants to survive. Most people want to be liked. I did once have a French participant on a course, and I said, everyone wants to be liked. He said, I don't care. I said, really? He says, well, I'm French and I'm a company accountant. And but in general, people want to be liked. Cultures love their young.
Yeah.
You show them a picture of kids and they smile. We're grateful for favors. That's universal. But then we tend to be programmed by the way in which we've been brought up to behave in different ways and have some different values. It can be very simple things like, how do we eat? Do we use a knife and fork? Do we keep the knife and fork in our hands the whole time if we're eating a steak like the Brits, or do we cut the meat up into small pieces like an American and then use just the fork? Or do we use chopsticks, or do we use our hands? I have some Indian partners, and they took me to a meal in their room at the hotel, and they'd ordered food. And I said, where's the knives and forks? He said, well, we just eat with our hands. But then it goes to deeper things like, if we're pushed, what do we choose? Do we choose to tell the truth, or is loyalty more important? So you get to these deeper things. How flexible or fixed are we with time? So you understand these values, and then think about communication. And I mentioned already direct and indirect communication. But how long should we pause? Well, many Finns, as we saw, will pause for a long time to think before they answer. My record in a meeting was, I asked this guy, do you want to buy the course? And it was 1.5 minutes. My colleague was timing it before he answered, and he was shuffling through the papers. My colleague, who was new to it, he was British, was squirming in agony at this silence. When you're talking to someone in a negotiation, what's more important? All the facts that they put on the table and how competent they are? Or is it more important, what's their tone of speech? Do you like them? Do you think you can trust them? And, how do they themselves like to communicate? Are they more interested in the non-spoken things? And are they more interested not in what you say, but what's your position in your organization? Can you actually make decisions? Where are you in the hierarchy? So there's a lot of complexity going on under the surface.
Yeah, this is actually my wheelhouse, the stuff I really, really love. I've been into this probably since '92 when I graduated. And so the idea of, I call it 3D negotiation. It's one thing is to understand the processes in the negotiation and what's going on, the substance, if you like. And the other thing is in 3D to understand what else is actually going on, right? How are you reading the room? What are different people? Who are the players? And sometimes the most powerful players may not even be in the room, right? And just to be aware of all this. But sometimes we can get it wrong, right? Sometimes we think we know, and I have somebody who once said to me that they were from the UK, they went to China to try and broker a deal, and they clumsily tried to assimilate into Chinese culture, and that was actually quite offensive. So the discussion that followed was, should I just be authentically British, or should I actually try and be a bit more sympathetic to the culture? And it was a huge debate. So where do you shake out with those kind of thoughts?
Well, to keep myself in a job, I would say that one ought to learn how to adapt. But it's a question of not pandering to the other culture, not imitating. And there's a famous picture of Obama meeting the Emperor of Japan, and Obama bows very low. And he's a tall guy, and he was bowing even lower than the emperor. And the Japanese were They didn't say it directly, but they were clearly embarrassed by this because he was imitating too much, as he was saying.
Right, right.
And to what extent is the other culture going to try and come part way? So you have to bear these things in mind. But there was a very interesting study published in the Harvard Business Review 5 years ago by two researchers. One was called Maxim Sitch, and Young H. Kim, who sounds like a Korean name. And it was called If You Want to Win Someone Over, Talk Like They Do. And it was a scientific study where they analysed correspondence between lawyers and judges in patent law cases in the US. So this wasn't a cross-cultural one, but it was about communication, so it still applies. And they used a computer to analyse the communication on both sides. And they found that where the lawyers, to some degree, mirrored the type of language that the judges used in terms of vocabulary, sentence length, style, syntax, etc., they had double the chance of winning their case. But I also get asked the question, which probably would maybe have been your next question, is that why should I adapt? Well, the question here is one of power. Who needs whom more than the other party? And I'll give you an example. I was working with one Nordic startup a few years ago, and they were trying to get investment from Far Eastern country. I won't say which, not to identify them. And I told them so much about the importance of adaptation, and they said, we're not going to adapt, we're going to be ourselves. Well, it ended up in a total disaster with the... I won't give you all the stages, but it ended up with the MD of the of the Nordic company, saying to the other party that their matriarch at the head of the family could be used as a guinea pig for this medical intervention that they'd designed. So suddenly it ended up calling a guinea pig, and when they asked, "Can you do this?" Instead of saying, well, we'll try, they said no. So that directness really put off the other party and damaged things. And they needed the other party far more. They're a small startup. They had a company willing to invest 120 million euros in them, and they lost it because they wouldn't adapt.
Yeah. I see this a lot. So I have a conferences company, so we're organising conferences all over the world, and I see... the effect of these overstepping cultural nuances, that the effect it can have on other players. But also a great deal of my work is with leadership teams, with founders as they're building highly effective leadership teams, cross-cultural leadership teams. And I wanted to ask you, when you look at teams, diverse teams today, if somebody was to ask you to put a case forward for why is it important to, if I'm running a team, why is it important for me to have different cultures in my team, as opposed to having people who look and think like me, who I can communicate with effectively, who get what I'm saying or get what I'm thinking, and we can move faster? What's the argument for the diverse teams?
In the end, and there have been many studies into this, diverse teams perform better. But the problem is that very often people pay lip service to diversity,
right,
but they don't use it. So it's all very well, and we've seen this in politics as well, it's all very well having a group of diverse people, but they could still be forced into falling in line with the leader's way of looking at things, and the diversity isn't used. So I think it's very important for it to work that you need to understand yourself and the others in the team. So you need to understand them. You need to state the objectives of the team very clearly. What are our objectives? And then you need to define them in ways which mean something to everyone. So if you just take a simple example, we may say, well, in our business model, we need to be flexible. Well, what does flexible mean to a German? What does flexible mean to an Italian? It may be different things. So you really have to define things. You need to really use diversity as an asset, and not in a sort of facile way of just a statement, we use diversity as an asset, but actually do it. So who is the right person to deal with this issue? Maybe in the team we've come across some personal disagreements and problems. Well, we know that in the team we've got someone from a culture that is very good at dealing with personal issues and could help resolve that. Maybe don't put the accountant in charge of that, And then I think it's very important not to see diversity as a barrier or a problem to be overcome, but to have fun and actually enjoy the differences.
Yeah. You posted something, I think, either this week or last week, around values, and you talked about the anywheres and the somewheres. Do you remember that post?
Yeah, I remember. Yeah.
I really liked that, and I just wondered whether maybe you could open up and share. Because when you said earlier on about let's go deeper and looking at the values, you mentioned the values of the anywheres versus the values of the somewheres, and then maybe share a little bit about is there tension between the two, and or is there a sweet spot?
Yeah, well, it was based on a book that I read recently. Unfortunately, I can't remember the guy's name. Maybe you've got it, but
No.
he wrote this a book which came out, I think, in 2017 or 18, and it was about anywheres and somewheres. And he said that particularly in the Western world, we've got some people who are essentially globalist, and they would be the sort of people who love going to Davos, believe in global organizations or transnational organizations, and they sort of, in a way, can deny their locality and where they're originally from. And they say, well, we're all global citizens, and we're all the same, basically. And we have our own core values, which are not determined by our locality. And then you've got the somewheres who are very much rooted in their locality. So, I mean, if I put it in my own world, if I maybe am meeting colleagues in Oxford or in journalist friends in London, etc., they tend to be more on the side of anywheres. But if I go into the pub in my local hometown of Bolton in the north of England, well, they're definitely somewheres. And I think this is behind quite a lot of the political polarization that we get.
Yeah.
And I'm not taking any side at all, but it is a sort of different worldview, global and local. I mean, I like to think that I'm a mixture personally, because my locality means a lot to me, the north of England, particularly the north of England. But I'm also, in my job, pretty global. So I think it's possible to keep both alive.
Yeah.
Where it gets dangerous is where the two sides attack each other.
Yeah, and then it becomes polarizing. And never the twain shall meet. And I think we are seeing that in some cases at the moment. But I don't know. Maybe I'm an optimist, Michael. I like to believe that there is a way through. I'd like to believe that this idea of looking for that sweet spot where you you genuinely get curious about what other people are thinking. I think that seems to me the idea of opening a corridor of curiosity in the other person. That seems to me to be the way forward. But again, that's my view. Maybe I'm in my own echo chamber, and that's my view. And there's other people that will say the complete opposite.
No, I mean, I'm an optimist as well at heart, and I think that one of the things about my job, in a way, is to try and bring people together. Obviously, most of my clients are in the corporate world, but I do work also with government on occasion, and I think trying to bring people together and understand that things can be both true and untrue at the same time,
Yeah,
which is a
yeah,
favourite quotation of mine from Schopenhauer.
yeah,
He said the sign of true intelligence is to understand that things can be both true and untrue at the same time.
yeah,
So it can be great to be a globalist, it can be great to be a localist. They don't have to always be at war with each other.
yeah, yeah. You mentioned as well, and I've had personal experience of this, but maybe you can share a bit more of your insights. We look at for example, China, and we might say, China, it's you have to spend a lot of time building relationships. It takes ages to build relationships, and so it's hard to do business when you're busy trying to build up relationships. But then you said, which I've experienced, is once you build a relationship, the business comes flowing through. You get requests like boom, boom, boom. Every other day there's a request. Whereas maybe in the West, it's the other way around. We'll send you the requests first. And what we're doing is we're building trust as we go. Maybe you could share your experience around that and any tips and advice you might be able to give.
Yeah, and I mean in negotiation, because our theme is negotiation, isn't it? Is that some cultures put all the facts and the competence first, and they want to assess your capability, maybe testing you by giving you a little bit of business. I mean, Germans typically will do this. We'll give you a little bit of business, and then we see how you perform. Is the quality good enough? Do you deliver on time? And gradually we begin to trust each other. And then we could even invite you out for a meal or a beer. In other cultures, they put the relationship first. And so not the task or the factual stuff, but the relationship is the important thing. And what they're doing there is testing your character. So if you go over to China and you're meeting people for the first time, then it's very likely that they'll take you to see things, the Forbidden City. I mean, just yesterday, I think it was, Keir Starmer was in Beijing and he was taken to see the Forbidden City.
Right.
It's a typical tourist thing. And then to eat with them. In China, typically to drink with them as well. I mean, if you're teetotal, they'll accept that. But, ideally they want to drink with you. And then character comes out. But I think, not to say one way is any better or worse, but I think as Westerners, we ought to try and appreciate there's actually a lot of sense in all this preamble of getting to know the other party. Because one of my colleagues at Oxford, Rupert Younger, talks about in trust building and in reputation about character versus capability. And Westerners are more interested in capability. What can you do?
Yeah.
The Chinese would be at first more interested in character.
Yeah.
But if you know someone's character and you can trust them and you like them, then they feel that, well, the rest can then fall into place. But a typical Western thing would be, right, you're capable, you're competent, we trust you. And then later down the line, you deceive us or you behave unethically. Oh, no, and that's very difficult to recover from. We wish we'd known this before.
Yeah. Yeah, I get myself into trouble a lot with this because there are. I know there's a big movement, a body of school where people say, look, it's got nothing to do with the trust. It's got nothing to do with the character of the person I'm talking to. It's can you deliver a competent product in the time frame at the price you say. If you can do that, then it doesn't matter whether I like you, it doesn't matter whether we're friends, that doesn't matter. What matters is the quality of the product or service that you've committed to delivering. Until the wheels fall off, as you just said, right? I guess it's okay until the wheels fall off. And so the work I do is around emotionally intelligent negotiation and having those difficult conversations. And this is when you add the layer of culture on top of it, it becomes even more nuanced. These conversations. I mean, most leadership teams are quite diverse by nature because we work in with a lot of multinational companies. What experience have you had in how people, when things get a bit nasty, when the pressure's on? What experience have you had in terms of being able to work with cultures and how they handle that type of pressure?
I think culture comes to the surface when there are problems. And you see this geopolitically as well. And very soon, when there's a geopolitical argument, you see leaders of countries complaining about the culture, blaming culture.
Right.
And, I remember some years ago when Greece was in real debt and there was a sort of war of words between Greece and Germany. And the Germans were basically saying, well, the Greeks, they're lazy and, really terrible things. And the Greeks saying, oh, you Germans, you want to control everything. You're forcing austerity on us. It's typical German to control. Well, there may be some truths, but it's getting people beyond that to say, look, are you sure you're just not labeling cultures stereotypically? What are the real interests underneath this, rather than falling into positions of nationality and, planting your flag on the table? What are the real issues under the surface? And so when I'm working with a team, for example, I get people to do a cross-cultural assessment, which I use to begin with, and they answer questions about themselves, but then they answer a mini question on each of their colleagues. And we look at the differences between how they saw themselves and how their colleagues see them. A while back, I had one team with quite a few different nationalities with a French leader. And when we started the feedback session, the first thing we talked about was communication. And in his own results, he'd come out as, I listen most of the time. So by answering various questions, the result was basically he thinks that he listened most of the time. So I said to him, are you prepared to see what the team think about you? And the team's result, couldn't see what the individual said, but the team as a whole said he talks most of the time. Well, there's a bit of a gap there, and gaps are always interesting, aren't they? So why? And when he asked them, why do you think this? They said, well, you don't seem to be focusing when we're talking to you. You're doing something else. You're, sending a text or an email. And he said, but I can multitask. I said, well, that's not the impression we get. And then you can take it deeper and say, is he really not a good listener to the team? Or is it that because you know he's French, anything that he does which is slightly French, like talking a few sentences longer than you'd expect, you think, yes, he's typically French. And you start labeling people based on your cultural preconceptions. So it does become quite subtle. And in the end, we're dealing with people and with individuals.
Well, it brings it back to what I think where we started off at the very top of the conversation is that this whole idea starts with yourself, right? It starts with a real deep awareness of yourself in real time, the judgments that you're making and where they're coming from. And the better we do that work on ourselves, the better we are able to understand other people.
Yeah. In ancient Greece, the inscription above the Delphic oracle was know thyself.
Yeah.
And it's easy to say it. Many of these things are easy to say, but you need to actually do it.
Yeah. Michael, we've done a pit stop through your vast experience, your vast knowledge, and I'd like to just end by asking you for listeners, if they want to contact you, if they want to know more about you, number one, how can they find you? And number two, what is it that you're working on right now that's really exciting?
The best way to contact me is via LinkedIn. And if you just put my name, Michael Gates, in LinkedIn, it should come up pretty soon because I use it quite a bit, so it should come up very easily. And what am I working on at the moment? Well, the biggest job that I did last year was working with a French company who are doing more and more business, partly with customers, but also having branches particularly in China and in India. And then they bought a German company a couple of years ago, and so trying to help them work mainly internally with others. So that's one interesting project. And then I'm working with another company in a couple of weeks who have opened in Mexico. So it's a European company opening in Mexico. So how to recruit Mexicans without letting cultural prejudice get in the way. So those are a couple of things. And I've got one very unusual project coming up, which is for a group of school children from a very exclusive private school funded by a tech billionaire in the US to come and do a study week in Finland and try and, sort of do a hackathon in a way, together with some Finnish school kids of a similar age, to have a completely different environment. I mean, they're based mainly in California, in big cities, and to go out into the forest with Finnish kids and find out about more sustainable ways of working, more in tune with nature. And that's really interesting for me because it's completely different from what I normally do. And so I'll be helping them understand the Finns before they interact with them.
Well, Michael, keep on doing the work that you do. Goodness knows the world needs it. I'd like to thank you very much for joining us today on Empathy at the Table. It's been a real pleasure talking with you, Michael.
A real pleasure. Thank you, Tony.
Thank you.